She found a lost little boy and raised him as if he were her own son. Years later, when he discovered who the child's father was, he couldn't contain his emotion. Joe opened his laptop and started reading his emails. He had barely gotten home when he received the news that one of his franchises was going to close. So he locked himself in his office and went back to work. "Daddy, Daddy!" The man heard his little son calling. "Come play with me, Daddy." From the office, the rich man shouted, "I can't now, Louie, Daddy's busy." It turns out that 38-year-old Joe owned a large chain of luxury restaurants in New York and had several establishments spread across the country. He had managed everything himself since his wife, Stella, passed away. Therefore, he was an extremely busy man and was unable to pay much attention to his son, who was only 3 years old. He was always at work or on business trips, and the one who stayed with the boy day and night was his housekeeper, Sylvia. The lady knocked on the millionaire's office door and said, "Sir, I think you should take a break. Why don't you come have dinner with us and play a little with Louie?" Joe knew he should be enjoying his little one, but he really had a lot of work to do. So, he explained that he was just going to finish one thing and would stay with them. Obviously, the businessman took longer than little Louie could handle, and when he finally left that office, his son was already asleep. "Joe, you work too much," Sylvia warned him. "Your son misses you so much, and ever since Ms. Stella passed, he keeps asking where his daddy is. You need to enjoy him." "I know, Sylvia. But you know how my life is. If it's not me, no one runs these restaurants, and then my son won't have a place to live," Joe replied, making an excuse. "Stop being so dramatic, Joe. I've known you since you were a baby. Your family was already wealthy when they hired me, and you've only gotten wealthier. You can totally afford to hire a manager to handle the finances while you enjoy your son's upbringing." Okay, I'll think about it," Joe said, irritated by the lecture Sylvia always gave him when he didn't spend time with little Louie. The days passed, and then came the child's birthday. The wealthy man had planned to travel to Disney with his son and the governess. He traveled all the time but never followed through since his wife died a year ago. He threw himself into work and forgot to live life and enjoy the things that really mattered. However, when they were all packed, Joe received a call that made him jump for joy. Some investors wanted a last-minute meeting to discuss opening a franchise abroad in Paris, which would be a dream come true for the millionaire since his restaurant chain was only national. He couldn't possibly miss this opportunity. So he told Sylvia that she would have to travel alone with Louie. The governess was angry and said, "But you can reschedule this meeting. Your son only turns 4 once, and you promised him this long ago." "Sylvia, I can't just tell the investors, 'Hey, wait there, I'm going to take my son to Disney and I'll be back in 5 days.' By then, they'll have found another restaurant to take to Paris. It's the chance of my lifetime. I can't throw it away for a birthday," Joe explained. Sylvia was silent and looked at him for a moment. Joe hated when she made that face. He knew she was right, but he had no choice. Then he signed an authorization and sent the governess and his son on the trip without him. "Son, come here. Daddy can't go to Disney with you guys, but I wish I could," Joe said as the little boy started to cry. "Daddy, Daddy, I miss you," the boy said, being wrapped in a tight hug by his father. "I know, my son. But Daddy has to do something very important, but I promise that when you get back, I'll go wherever you want, okay?" The businessman gave his son one last hug and handed him over to Sylvia, who looked at him disappointedly. He said goodbye to the governess and asked her to let him know when they arrived. He put the two on his private jet and went off to prepare for his meeting. The boy would have all the comfort there as always, besides Sylvia, who was always by his side, and the entire crew of Joe's jet was there to serve them. So the man was not worried about their well-being, as that was what he worked so hard for, in a way. This reasoning alleviated his guilt for not being present at many important moments in his son's life. Then the businessman went to his meeting while Louie and Sylvia took off. However, Joe did not know that this would be the last time he would see them. After spending the afternoon resolving the procedures to open his franchise in Paris, the wealthy man returned home, all happy and proud of his achievement. Now, according to him, he could consider passing the management to a manager and enjoying life with his son. Since one of his establishments was in one of the cities with the largest and best gastronomy in the world, his fortune would triple, and he wouldn't have to worry about anything else. Joe then sat on his sofa and settled in. He didn't even remember the last time he had snuggled there, since he only stayed in that office. He picked up his cell phone and looked to see if he had any message from Sylvia saying they had arrived. How strange, he thought. She should have notified that they had landed. They should have arrived 2 hours ago. Joe tried to call the governess, but he always heard that it was out of area or turned off. He thought maybe they got so excited that they went for a walk a bit and the lady had forgotten to turn on her cell phone after the flight. After an hour, the man began to get really worried. He was already on his 30th call and nothing. He started to have a bad feeling, but always tried to calm down. Calm down, Joe, they're fine. They must just be delayed. Soon she'll call me, and I'll talk to my son. He waited another half hour, then decided to call the hotel in Orlando, United States, where they were supposed to be staying, and that's when his heart froze. Sylvia and Louis had not checked in yet, and the hotel staff were waiting. The millionaire stood still for a moment, imagining what could have happened. Then he contacted the aviation company responsible for his jet, and that's when that poor man heard the worst news. Mr. Joe, we regret to inform you that the tower lost contact with your jet several hours ago. From the coordinates we have here, they didn't even leave Brazil. The signal disappeared somewhere in Mato Grosso. We have already contacted the local police and firefighters, and we are waiting for new information. The businessman was catatonic, paralyzed. He didn't make any sound, and for a moment, nothing went through his head other than one thing, his little Louis. Tears began to fall from the eyes of that man sitting on the sofa, staring at nothing. He could only think about what had happened to his son. Why hadn't he gone along? Why had he let the little one travel alone? Then, without thinking twice, he took the location of the last coordinates obtained by the tower and bought an airline ticket at the last minute to Cuiabá, which was the closest place to where the signal had disappeared. He arrived there in approximately 2 hours and stayed at a hotel, in contact the entire time with the central and with the police officers investigating the area. With each hour that passed without news of his son, Joe became more anguished. For the first time since his wife had passed, he, who was not a very religious man, prayed to God not to take his little Louis. Joe felt that something very bad had happened. Just 2 days later, they found the plane crashed in a forest somewhere about 220 kilometers from the capital. It was terror for the man. He traveled to the location with the police, and when he got there, he was horrified. His jet was destroyed, with half of it on one side and another km later. Everyone there, the crew and Sylvia, had not survived. Joe screamed and cried in horror at what he was seeing. The police and firefighters tried to calm the man down, but he was inconsolable. He asked countless times where his son was, but then they gave him the worst news he could receive. Joe, unfortunately, we don't have a less painful way to say this, but we haven't found your son's body. We think he was thrown out of the plane when it hit the ground. Since he was only 3 years old, we don't believe he could have survived. He was too small. His body couldn't withstand an impact. Tears kept gushing from that poor man. They had to take him back to Cuiabá because he was beside himself. No, no, why God? Why did you take my son? Wasn't it enough to have taken my wife from me? Now my little one too, thought the businessman, desolate. When everyone was declared deceased, Joe returned to his home in New York and stayed there for months. He no longer appeared in his restaurants and left everything to his new manager, who had to take care of everything during the man's mourning, which seemed to be eternal. Meanwhile, in a small village called Santo Afonso in Mato Grosso, there was Ariel. She was a young woman, about 35 years old, who provided domestic services in the homes of the elderly in the village who were no longer able to do much. She helped them with lunch and cleaning the house. She was very kind and gentle with everyone, and when she wanted to clear her mind, Ariel would take long walks and hikes through the forest, follow a stream that was a few kilometers from her village, and camp there for a few days. One day, during one of her adventures through the forest, the woman heard a noise like a child crying and went after it. When she arrived at the place, she was horrified by what she saw. There was Edgar's little boy, Louis, all dirty, injured, and scared. "Hi, my dear. Where did you come from?" said the woman, running and wrapping the little boy up. Ariel was desperate with the situation. She had no idea how that child had ended up there. She rushed him to the only doctor in the village and took care of him until he recovered. The traumatized little boy couldn't say anything about what had happened. He didn't know where he was from or who his parents were. He could only say his name when she asked, so it was impossible for the woman to find out how to locate his family. After a month of taking care of the boy, Ariel had already grown fond of him, and after several unsuccessful searches about that little boy or his family, the woman, who had the dream of being a mother, decided to keep him and raise him as her own son. Meanwhile, in New York, Joe cried day and night. He suffered for several months until he managed to get out of bed. He was devastated since the death of his governess, Sylvia, and his little boy, Louis. They were the only family he had left, and now he had no one else. As he couldn't stay in mourning forever, Rangel, his manager who was managing his chain of luxury restaurants, asked him to come back to work so he could start recovering from that tragedy and get back to his life. However, what Rangel didn't understand was that poor man's life would never be the same again. His will to live had run out, his strength had unraveled. He didn't want to eat or drink anymore. He spent months without washing his hair or shaving. He was deplorable. Then, one day, he had a dream. Louis was running happily through a forest, laughing and playing with a woman who Joe thought was Stella, his deceased wife. They were so happy together that seeing that gave him peace. The millionaire woke up that day feeling that his son was well, wherever he was, because now he was with his mother. What he didn't know was that the woman in his dream was not Stella but Ariel, who was taking care of the little boy with all the love and care that a mother could give. After this event, Joe got up, took a bath like never before, shaved, and cut his hair, which had already reached his shoulders. He put on his suit, applied a nice-smelling cologne, and went to his restaurant. Everyone there greeted him and celebrated his return. He really was back now. He wanted to find his rare son and return to living, just as he had seen in his dream. Then 2 years passed, and Ariel and Louis were like mother and son. They loved each other very much. The boy loved living in that village, Santo Afonso, a quiet place southwest of Cuiabá in Mato Grosso, about 250 kilometers from the capital. It had just over 3,000 inhabitants, and everyone there knew each other. When little Louis arrived in town, he brought joy to those people, since the village didn't have many young children. It was mostly made up of elderly people and adults Ariel's age. Therefore, when the woman started raising the little boy as if he were her own, taking him to the elderly home where she worked as a maid, everyone fell in love with him. He was very polite and kind, just like his mother, Stella, had been. However, 2 years later, Louis was now 6 years old, and things started to get financially tight for Ariel. She wanted to be able to give her son a good education and a higher quality of life in a place with more opportunities. It was then, advised by the village doctor, who was her very good friend and who had already lived in New York, that she decided to go there to try for a better life. Since she had impressive cleaning skills and was a great cook, she thought about trying for a job in that field. Arriving in New York, she rented a room where she slept with her son, as they couldn't afford a house or an apartment of their own. She left her son at home with the old lady who lived there and handed out her resume in homes and restaurants, trying to get work as a maid or cook. As the woman had not finished any schooling, since she needed to work to support her parents when they were alive, it was getting difficult to find a place where her education was not a problem. Until one day, almost a month after so much searching, she found out that a restaurant was in need of a cleaner. She went there, and by pure coincidence, it was one of Joe's luxury restaurants. She was interviewed by the businessman himself, who liked her a lot from the start. Ariel was very beautiful, and he sympathized with her. Since she was very communicative and knew how to sell her fish, she convinced the millionaire that she was very efficient and that she would do a great job as a cleaner in his establishment. He liked her attitude because he appreciated people who valued doing their best work, regardless of what it was. So he hired her. With the salary at a luxurious place like that, Ariel was able to rent a small apartment just for her and her little boy, Louis. She put him in a better school and was gaining more and more admiration from Joe, who saw how hardworking and efficient that woman was. Until one day, one of the restaurant chefs got sick and ended up missing work. It was an important day because the wealthy man was going to receive some businessmen in his establishment, and he was worried about how much his employee's absence would affect the speed of the dishes coming out. Everything was crazy, so when Ariel saw that the staff couldn't handle it, she dropped her brooms and simply started cooking the orders from the businessmen. The people were amazed because she was doing very well, and when those men ate her food, they were enchanted by the taste and presentation of those dishes. Joe was amazed at the woman who, besides being beautiful, was a perfect cook. He decided to promote the maid to chef of his restaurant and did not regret it, as sales tripled after Ariel's entry. It wasn't long before Joe fell in love with Ariel, who shared the same feeling. At one of their meetings, she told him about her son, and the wealthy man was very happy because he wanted to be for him the father he had never been for his little one. But the millionaire had no idea that fate was about to give him a second chance. She knew the whole tragic story of the death of his wife and son but didn't know their names. So, sometime later, Ariel and Joe ended up getting together. After a month of dating, the woman felt it was time for her boyfriend to meet her son, as she felt she was ready to introduce her most precious asset to the person who might one day be her husband. But she could never have imagined that the moment the two saw each other, Joe would fall to his knees and start crying inconsolably. The little boy took a while to recognize him, but after he remembered his father, he ran into his arms and started crying. "Daddy, Daddy, I missed you, Daddy," said the boy, being enveloped by the man's tight hug. Ariel was paralyzed and perplexed by that scene. She simply couldn't believe it. Tears started streaming down her eyes because what she saw was both emotional and tragic, since for a second, she thought she would lose her son. But to everyone's joy, Joe got up after hugging his little Louie a lot and walked up to his beloved, kissed her, and wrapped his arms around her, thanking her immensely for bringing his son back and giving him the will to live again. The three of them, Joe, Ariel, and Louie, got married a while later and were happy as a beautiful family united by destiny. What do you think of this story? Do you think they acted right? Leave your comment below to know your opinion. It is very important to us. If you liked this exciting story, help us by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Thank you very much for watching us and see you in the next story.